part of what our protagonists are weighing is, are we less than human if we are feigning empathy with somebody who's obviously a monster?
Yeah.
Are we worse off if we're not feigning the empathy, if we actually feel it? Charlize said to me, there's a writer I want you to meet. His name is Joe Penhall, and he wrote The Road. And Joe came in and kind of took all the materials, went away for a couple of months, and came back with a pitch that was pretty much the only way to do this, which is to dramatize the time, the place, the crater that was created by this new thinking. If we stayed religiously to the chronology and called everybody by their real names and tried to get the life rights, and when a lot of people were divorced, a lot of people weren't speaking to each other, some of them were dead, and it was an inordinately complex bowl of spaghetti to unwind. And he said, I don't want to deal with real people. I want to be free to dramatize this as it should be for the uninitiated. And so out of the basement grew this program of trying to sit with the most depraved minds that you could find, to have them explain what was going through your head. You had to sort of acknowledge that your enemy was human. There were things about him that you didn't understand, but if you could empathize with him, he might let you in on it. And that was an interesting notion, the notion of this massive, let's chase him, let's find him, let's kill him, let's electrocute him, whatever. And all of a sudden they were saying, let's just have a really nice conversation.
We're doing research, interviewing men like you.
Men like me.
Murderers with multiple victims, to better understand why you do what you do.
We didn't want it to be serial killer of the week, but by the same token, part of what they're trying to codify, what they're trying to understand, what they're trying to pigeonhole, in its most sort of demeaning, is who these people are and where they fit into their particular filing cabinet at the FBI. We wanted to show that. A lot of the stuff that Kemper says is on record. It's not as though that even required much research. And he is oddly eloquent, in a way about even his own sort of empathetic shortcomings. But that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to talk about the compelling and yet appalling nature of these conversations. Mm-hmm. The thing about people who hunt people is that they have very attuned instincts to behavior, and they are minutely attuned to when they're coming across appallingly and when they're coming across seductively and when they're coming across as matter of fact. And so for me, the conversations are obviously the lifeblood of the work that they're doing. So it becomes sort of the lifeblood of the story about the work that these guys are doing. But it's also, it's a power struggle. It's the dynamic between teacher and student, the dynamic between FBI agent and serial murderer. There are ways that they insist on seeing themselves that you can play into it, or you can call them on it. You can offer resistance and see how they respond. And it's an elaborate kind of game of chess. And at the core of it, the notion that there were people within, this massive bureaucracy who saw the value in, even if they couldn't sympathize with them, that they needed to empathize with them in order to understand them. And in understanding them, they would have a greater understanding of the personal signature of the subconscious. These guys, in a lot of cases, are working in incredible haste. They've done something unconscionable, and they need to tidy up pretty quickly. So they've thought this stuff through. They've kind of, part of what our protagonists are weighing is, are we less than human if we are feigning empathy with somebody who's obviously a monster? Yeah. Are we worse off if we're not feigning the empathy, if we actually feel it?
How do we get ahead of crazy if we don't know how crazy thinks?
The preparation for the interviews is very different than what you see on television, and where they go into the prison and they have a tape recorder on and taking notes. When I do the interview, I go into the police files first, the medical examiner's reports. I have all that. I look at the circumstances of how he was apprehended, if he gave a confession, did he volunteer the confession, or they just kind of worked him over for a period of time. When I get to the prison itself, I then go into review the police records, the files, I should say, in corrections, that they have built up over the past years, on him. See how he's being analyzed by psychologists, there. And so when I walk into the room, I won't have notes. I won't have tape recorders or anything like that, because I found early on when we did that, when we interviewed, say, Charles Manson, Ed Kemper, we had a small tape recorder and it was a little cassette, and they didn't like that. They were very, very paranoid. They live and they should be paranoid living where they are in a prison, where you can't turn your back on someone without fear of being knifed. They don't want to be perceived as a snitch or anything like that. So by having a tape recorder or notes, what are you going to do with this stuff? And the approach would be more conversational. It's always positive. You may even give them kind of some false hopes that, the warden knows you're cooperating with us here. We're helping. What you're doing is helping us, who we're receiving cases from all over the world now, and we're going to apply what we learned from you and others to these other cases, seeing if there are, in fact, the similarities that can cross over into these other crimes. If you do it right, they don't want you to leave. They don't want you. You begin to even tell them, as you're gaining an experience, they want to know about themselves. What do you think? What made me tick? What? And then some of them are very arrogant, that bragging about the crimes that they did, and that they're so good. They made a mistake, they got caught, but it was a fluke. This is the formula I've used, and I've mentioned in this book and other books, why plus how equals who. Well, now we have the who. In this case, it's not an unknown subject case. We got the guy. Why and hows of the behavior. And see, is there anything that he can tell us that I can apply to other cases?
The question is not only why did the killer do it, but why did the killer do it this way?
There was something that we could learn from these people about this, what felt at the time like a new sort of crime. The show takes place, and these procedures were developed in the late 70s. And so we had seen kind of the rise of the serial killer in the 60s and 70s. But the crimes themselves were quite mysterious to traditional law enforcement because there was no obvious motive. Law enforcement at that time usually looked for, and we go through this in the show, looked for need or greed as being the reason for a crime to be committed, which is why, you look to the spouse, you look to the business partner, but these crimes they couldn't be solved that way. So John and Robert, they started working together fairly quickly, realized that if they could talk to these people who were committing these seemingly motiveless crimes, they could get into the psychology of the crime, and then the crime scene itself could kind of reveal what sort of psychology the killer was operating under. And then Anne came in, and she was a professor. She developed methods for them to actually break down the data.
I wrote episode 5, which is a case based on a true crime. This particular crime was a couple of paragraphs in the book, and what you can find online is basically one old brief article. And this was the case, like for Monty Rissell, for example, there was not a lot of background information. But for this case in particular, there were a couple of articles and 2 paragraphs in the book. So then it became a matter of, as a dramatist, how do you find the different voices for these characters? But obviously one character was kind of the weakling of the bunch, and the other character was the more aggressive.
Well, I'm not an expert. I'm not an authority. I'm someone who has been a murderer for almost 20 years. I'm just an extremely accomplished murderer.
Joe developed this with David for about 3 years and did a ton of research Joe watched those videos. Those videos were quite handy for us in terms of, and for Cameron, I believed he watched the videos. And then what's lovely for a writer is that Kemper speaks in such a specific cadence that it's such a gift, because, one of the challenges on this show was to find the different voices of the killers, and Kemper was really the only one that there were videos of. Some of them there's articles, some of them there's not much information on them. So to find those different voices. So it was so great with Kemper to have a voice that was already there. And Joe really captured that in those opening episodes. And then I did some work on the final episode in that Kemper scene. And it was, he was such an easy character to write for because the voice was so established.
If you're going to play a serial killer who was able to, he'd pull up, he practiced for 2 years having, pulling up to a college and inviting someone, hey, you need a ride? And if he did it the wrong way, they wouldn't get in the car if they felt a weird vibe. So he started learning ways to just, he'd pull up and be checking the mirrors or playing with the radio, saying, hey, you need a ride or something, just keeping it really casual. So he sort of developed these ways of gaining people's trust. And whenever I see a very cinematic serial killer, I think, how would you ever get a victim if they don't feel that you're just a regular Joe? Mm-hmm. So my job, in my mind, wasn't to focus on the sinister element to this. Nobody really thinks they're evil. My job was to go to dog parks and take Uber rides and go to the grocery store in character and see if people would enjoy his company. You made a character and then you make your character's character as a serial killer. There's a mask they wear to seem human. And again, they are human, but seem like everyone else, I suppose.
Hello everyone, thanks for watching. On this channel, we are going to be learning how some of the best TV shows and films were created, hearing from the creators themselves. If this is something that would be interesting to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and join us as we take a look behind the curtain.